My name is Keith. Welcome to Truth Community Church. A special thank you to you. If this is your first time here, if you are visiting, welcome. You came on a good Sunday because last Sunday it didn't look all Christmassy. Today it looks all Christmassy. We had a team come in on Wednesday and they blew this place up with Christmas music. I don't know. I went outside. I had the Rat Pack on. Like, that's the kind of Christmas music I like. I came back in. Christina Aguilera was on. Like, it was like Christmas pop. And I was like, where did Dean Martin go? But I let them listen to what they wanted to because they did an excellent job. If it is your first time here, before you leave today, connect with me, connect with someone on our welcome team. They're wearing lanyards. We just have a gift we want to give you as a way of saying thank you for being here. And if you want to know more about what's going on, there's a connection card in the chairs in front of you. So while I'm talking, or at some point, if you fill that out, drop it in one of our boxes just so we can send you a thank you card and let you know what we have going on here. We are actually concluding a series called Live Generously. We've been talking about this idea that generosity is way more than money for about 7-8 weeks now. We've been exploring different areas of our lives where we don't want just generosity to be what comes out of our pockets, what comes out of our wallets. We want generosity to define all the areas of our lives. And sometimes money is like the easier side. Are we generous with our relationships, right? We talked about forgiveness. Are we generous with our time? Are we generous in how we treat strangers? And so if you want to hear any of those messages, you can go to our website and listen to those. And today we're going to conclude by talking about power. We're going to talk about influence, and we're going to talk a little bit about money. So if it is your first time here and you had the thought that the church only talks about money, don't let this be your last time here. Come back next week. We're going to talk about Christmas. All right, but today we are going to talk a little bit about money. There's an organization called World Vision, which maybe you're familiar with. They're kind of a faith-based organization, and their mission statement, so I don't get it wrong, is that they exist to bring aid to those who are hurting around the world. That's why they exist. And they do this in a myriad of different ways. They do it by helping children who are in need. My wife and I have sponsored a child through World Vision before, where we've sent this organization money, and the medical needs, the physical needs, the basic needs of life were provided for that child. They do this by being one of the first response teams when disaster strikes. So you have other organizations like the Red Cross and Convoy of Hope. World Vision is on the ground as well when disaster comes. They advocate for those who are being unjustly treated, when there's oppression for women and for children being worked too hard in certain areas of the world. So this is kind of who World Vision is as an organization, but I want to talk to you about the president of World Vision, Rich Stearns. Rich Stearns wasn't always the president of World Vision. Before that, he was the CEO of Lennox. All right, maybe some of you guys have Lennox stuff. I have Lennox stuff. It like never gets used. Like, someone gives you Lennox, you're like, great, this is going to be on display forever. Our Lennox stuff is kind of in our basement right now because we're too afraid to use it because you don't want to break it. So we have a nice Lennox bowl and a nice Lennox plate, but you know what Lennox is? It's high-end, good china, right? So Rich Stearns was the CEO of Lennox, the CEO. This guy, he moved up the corporate ladder to become like head of this company. And then he had this life-changing moment where he started to not just see the people who were in front of him, but he started to get a bigger vision for the people who he didn't always see, but people who were in need. And he did this on one of his trips around the world, and it totally changed his life, totally broke him. So he resigned as CEO. Imagine handing it. I've resigned as CEO to be president of a non-for-profit faith-based organization to help people. He gave up all of that power. He gave up all that influence. And he has a book called Whole in the Gospel, which I've read, and I encourage you to read it if you want to hear his story. But we can look at Rich Stearns and think, wow, like if I had that much power, if I had that much money, that much influence, I don't know that I would give it up. I don't know. If that was me, I don't know that I can hand that over for something else. Now, this morning, what I want to do is I want to change that question a little bit for us. Instead of saying, if I had that power, I want us to say, what am I doing with the power I have? Because I know in this room, we may not feel like we have the power of a CEO, or maybe some of us do. We may not feel like, look, I have everything that I need. Look, I have so much wealth. I have so much power and influence. But the reality is every single person here, maybe not the infants, but the adults in this room, right? We have, and they do too. My 4-month-old dictates when I wake up. So I guess she does have power. But all of us have a certain amount of power and influence towards other people, right? Think of the relationships that you have. For me, I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a pastor, I'm a son, I'm a friend, all of these different relationships. And in each one of these, there's opportunity for me to leverage the relationship in such a way. Maybe in a way where I gain, maybe in a way where the other person gains. But every single one of us here have power, have influence. And since all of us have this power and all of us are using this power, it's very important that we understand how. How? If you can meet me here and say, okay, I'm agreeing with you so far. Yes, I can think of the relationships I have. Yes, I can think of the influence and power that I have. Then let me ask you, how are you using it? How are you using the power you have? How are you leveraging it? Is there a right way to use the power that we have? What would it take to maybe change the way that we're using our power? Right? Rich, he had to go through something that changed his trajectory, changed the course of life that he was on, that pulled him from this path to that path. Something did that. So what would it take for us today to maybe change the way we're using our power? I'm glad you guys asked all these questions because that's what I had written down in my notes. So I knew you were going to ask this, so I'm asking it for you. But what we're going to do is we're going to look at a man named Zacchaeus today. And Zacchaeus, he had a great amount of power. He had a great amount of influence and a great amount of wealth. But because of something that Jesus did in his life, it started to change the way he was using all of those things. We're going to read Luke chapter 19 together. Verses 1 to 5. If you don't have a Bible, we have them in this room for you. We're also going to have the scriptures up here on this screen for you to follow along with. But if you don't own a Bible, before you leave, grab one of the Bibles in the baskets under these chairs. That's our gift to you. And continue reading in Luke 19. We're going to read 5 verses together today. And something we like to do as we read this text is stand and read it corporately together, just as a way to honor this text. So would you stand with me now? And we're going to read Luke 19, verses 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Jesus entered Jericho and made his way through the town. There was a man there named Zacchaeus. He was the chief tax collector in the region, and he had become very rich. He tried to get a look at Jesus, but he was too short to see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree beside the road, for Jesus was going to pass that way. When Jesus came by, he looked up at Zacchaeus and called him by name. Zacchaeus, he said, quick, come down. I must be a guest in your home today. You may be seated. That was beautiful. Y'all sound like a really good choir. Anyone here grew up in Sunday school and you know the Zacchaeus song? Like when I read this passage, I hear Zacchaeus was a wee little man was he? No, just me? All right. Well, this is what I hear. As I prepared for this, I couldn't get it out of my head. There are three really important cultural things that we all need to understand before we realize the transformation that comes to Zacchaeus' life. The first is this: when we think of tax collectors today, maybe we think of the government, we think of IRS workers, and we might get like a little weirded out. Like, have you ever met someone and found out they worked for the IRS and then it's like, all right, like you start some like I'm going to be careful. Like all of a sudden we get a little weird. I have a friend who works for the IRS, so I can say that. But we get a little weird around like April's going to come and it's like, do I have the right amount of stuff? Can I write off this? Is there a way I can write off Starbucks? Like that's the things that I think of, like work related, right? So we get a little weird. But in Jesus' day, when they heard tax collector, they didn't get a little weird about it. They got angry about it. Because in Jesus' day, tax collectors were Jewish men who were employed by Rome to collect taxes from the other Jews on their behalf. So the Jewish people were taken over by Rome, this empire that was just conquering different villages and towns and cities at this time. And they had taken over the Jewish people. And in order to kind of get some of them on their side, they would employ some of them. And so if you're a Jewish person and you see a tax collector, you look at that person and you hate them. Because they're a traitor. They're siding with the enemy. And not only that, they were mainly greedy because Rome had given them no cap on how much tax they could enforce. It was basically just make sure we get our cut, and whatever you want to charge, you have free to do that. And so some of these guys ran wild with that, and you had to pay your taxes. Like surrounding these tax collectors were Roman guards who would make sure you have to pay your tax. And so they would look at these tax collectors and they would get a little more angry than we do when we find that our friend works for the IRS. The second thing you need to understand, which is kind of similar to our culture, is the more wealth you have, the more power you have. Those two things go hand in hand, right? We can agree on that. If I have more money, there's more things that I can do. There's more influence I can have, right? There's more power. And we read that Zacchaeus was very rich, meaning he was very powerful. He was very influential. Even though people hated him because of his profession, he still had an immense amount of power to leverage against them. Right? You walk past Zacchaeus' tax booth and he doesn't care who you are. He's going to ask you to pay your taxes. And it doesn't make a difference what you think about him. You're going to pay your taxes. So he has influence and power. Now, the third thing you have to understand about this culture, I'm going to quiz you, so make sure you're listening. The third thing you have to understand is this: men in this culture did not run. They just didn't. Like, I enjoy going out for runs, right? We have all our Nike gear. It's like, let's do this. That's part of our culture. In first century Jerusalem, that's not what you did. You didn't have the white wardrobe. Is that the way to say it? The right wardrobe for that. Right? They didn't run. They didn't climb trees. That was humiliating. That was embarrassing. They didn't have jeans. So if you climb a tree, it's not great. It's a little drafty. So that was just something that they didn't do. So we have to understand these three things, all right? You remember them? The first is this: they hated tax collectors. More money means more power, right? Other philosophers say more money, more problems. More money, more power. And last, in this culture, you do not run if you're a man. So how do these things impact what's going on in Zacchaeus' life when Jesus comes? Verse 3 said that when he came to town, he, being Zacchaeus, wanted to see who Jesus was. But because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. Now, we're not like, what, did Luke have something against Zacchaeus too? Like, how to pick on his height? But understand what's going on here. And I know I can relate to this guy. Like, I didn't get the height in my family. My wife and I, we're of average stature. Amy's a little bit shorter. She's 5'0". There's no extra numbers there. So she's 5 foot. Now, we enjoy going to concerts a lot. We really do. Anytime we go to a concert, we'll go and we usually do the general admission, which means we're going to stand for like 3 hours till it starts and then stand for 3 hours during it. But that's what we enjoy doing. But our height plays a bad factor when it comes to general admission tickets. So we try to get there early so we can be first and rush up to the gate, but it doesn't always work that way. We've had instances where Amy and I have been behind much taller individuals. And I feel bad for Amy because she's like, I just paid $40 to stare at this guy's back for 3 hours. But there are moments where you know, like you just check out who's around you. There are moments where tall people will do that. And not just tall people. I think anyone will. But in this case, there are moments where someone will do that and see us shorter people just hiding behind them, trying to see. And they'll be polite and kind and say, hey, do you want to stand in front of me? Because us moving up isn't going to hurt their view. And we've had that experience a few times in those people being kind, being polite towards us. And yet here for Zacchaeus, no one in the crowd is moving for this guy, right? No one is looking at him and saying, oh, Zach, buddy, come on up. You want to see Jesus too? There's not one person that wants to do that. Why? Because they hated him. Because they didn't like him. Because no one in that crowd was his friend. Because to that crowd, Zacchaeus was a traitor. He was greedy. He was power hungry. He wanted everything he had for himself. And even though he had all of this power, all of this influence, it could not give him the one thing that all of us truly long for: love, relationship, embrace from another person, acceptance. That's not one thing, but those things. Zacchaeus couldn't buy that with his power and influence. The crowd wasn't making it easy for Zacchaeus to see Jesus that day. But Zacchaeus wanted to see him. And I questioned, why was Zacchaeus so hung up on seeing Jesus? Of course, he had heard the rumors of this guy who was coming from town to town and healing people. Of course, he had heard the stories of someone who was feeding people and teaching very differently than any other teacher they had. But why specifically was Zacchaeus so bent on seeing Jesus that, as we read, he would humiliate himself by running and then climbing a tree? And I think the answer is because he wanted to discover, how is Jesus going to treat me? He knew how the crowd was treating him. He knew how everyone else had treated him. He knew that he had sided with Rome and that it had cost him relationship. He knew that people would invite him over for Thanksgiving. People wouldn't have him over for a football game. That wasn't going to happen for Zacchaeus. He was going to charge his taxes and he was going to go home by himself. But he heard about Jesus, someone who was hanging out with tax collectors. Hey, that's who he was. someone who was hanging out with sinners, someone who was hanging out with drunks, someone who was hanging out with people that society was like, we don't want to spend time with you. Jesus was spending time with those people. So Jesus comes in through Jericho, and Zacchaeus says, will you reject me the way they've rejected me? Will you hold the decision I've made for power and influence against me? Even though I've chosen these things at the extent of hurting other people, will you hold that against me, Jesus? So he runs ahead and embarrasses himself. He climbs a tree and humiliates himself. This man of power and influence is up in a tree now so he can get a look at Jesus. What an act of determination. And what does Jesus say to Zacchaeus? I must be a guest in your house today. You know, we discovered a few weeks ago that hospitality was a really big deal in Jesus' culture. Hospitality was kind of different than the way we navigate it. I'm sure if you got together with friends and family this past week, it was people that you care about. It was people that care about you. And there probably wasn't any ulterior motive of you saying, I'm going to open my house to you so that you can do something for me. You've already accepted that person, so they're in your life that way. Hospitality in Jesus' day meant that when you open your house to someone, when you go to their house, you're not just going into their living space, you're going into their life. This culture was very big on who are you sharing a meal with? Who are you eating with? We're watching you, especially Jesus. And so for Jesus to say, I need to go to your house, Zacchaeus, he is looking at this tax collector, traitor, greedy person and saying, I want to be your friend. I want to come into your life. I want to have a relationship with you. And what's really, really fascinating is when Jesus says he's going to do it. Today. Oh, maybe you would love to have a relationship with Jesus, but you've thought the only way Jesus is going to accept me is if I change. The only way that Jesus is going to actually care about me is maybe if I start going to church more. I should probably give away some money, right? Maybe I should stop this habit. And we think these things in order to prove our worth to Jesus. And yet here we're seeing a snapshot of the gospel that says Jesus came to us as we are. Jesus looks at us in our filth. He looks at us in our sin and says, I want to know you now, today. He doesn't say to Zacchaeus, look, I want you to come down here. I want you to clean up. You need to make right all these relationships. And maybe I'll make it in time for dessert. Like, I don't know if you're going to get this all done by dinner, but I'm going to try my best to be there later if you do some work. He says, no, come down. I want to go to your house today. See, Jesus is saying, I'm loving you to make you lovely, not because you are lovely. That has to hit us. Jesus is saying, I'm loving you to make you something, not because you are already this thing. And in this moment, Zacchaeus' world is completely changed. This act of love that Jesus shows towards Zacchaeus completely changes his life. Verse 8, we read this. Zacchaeus stood before the Lord and said, I will give half my wealth to the poor, Lord. And if I have cheated people on their taxes, I will give them back 4 times as much. Now, even without understanding the culture and the laws, I mean, that sounds pretty lofty, right? I'm going to give away half of my wealth. If I cheated someone, I'm going to pay them back 4 times. And we can look at that and say, wow, like that's dramatic. But let me paint an even greater picture for you and explain what the law was. The law in this day was that if you had wealth to give, you needed to give 10% of it away. Or maybe you've heard the word tithe before. This was the law that the Jewish people lived under. That 10% of what they had, they would give to make sure the needs of people were met. It would go to the temple and it would be distributed out to the poor, to the priest, to whoever needed it at that time. So Zacchaeus is saying, because Jesus has asked me, or has rather said, I'm coming to your house, I'm not going to give 10%. No, that's too easy. I'm going to give 50% of what I have away. And the law had said that if you ever cheated someone, if you ever stole something, you were to pay them back in full plus 20%. So 120% is what the law required. And Zacchaeus says, no, that's just too easy. I'm going to pay back 400%. That's mind-blowing. He looks at what Jesus has done for him and says, 10% is not enough. I'm going 50. 120% is not enough. I'm going 400%. Now, Zacchaeus was previously using his power and his influence and his wealth to profit himself, but now he wants to help other people. This was a sign that a change had taken place in Zacchaeus' life. You have to guess if Jesus did something for Zacchaeus. This guy is just dishing out cash as a sign of saying, look, Jesus has done something in my life. He's being generous with his money, which was his power. The more money you have, the more power you have, the more of the world you can control and influence. And Zacchaeus was forfeiting this because of what Jesus did. Now, I could close the iPad here and charge us and say, look at Zacchaeus. We all need to be like him. Look at the way he gave. Look at how he changed. And we can elevate Zacchaeus to be the hero of this story. We can look at him and applause and say, look at the example he set. Man, I don't know if Jesus has changed my life. I want to be like Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus is not the hero of this story, though. If we do that, if we close up now and end, we're simply going to be giving ourselves a standard that we can't meet and a standard that God is not enforcing on us. There's another hero in this story. There's someone else in this story who had to forfeit something so that Zacchaeus could get to the place that he was at. And that's Jesus. What did it cost Jesus to accept Zacchaeus that day? I mean, right? Are you a little confused like I am? Like Jesus just says, I'm going to come to your house, and suddenly this guy's giving away half of his money and paying back for, like, what else? Did I miss a verse? Yes, kind of. I skipped over it. We're going to read verse 7 to kind of show what happened. It's dramatic. I have to build it. They taught me that in Bible school. See, not everyone was happy that Jesus went to Zacchaeus' house that day. In verse 7, we read this: the people were displeased. He has gone to be the guest of a notorious sinner, they grumbled. But what's happening here is that in order for Jesus to get into Zacchaeus' life, Jesus has to forfeit his own power and influence that day. Jesus has to give up the power that he has over the crowds, over the masses. These people came flocking to him as he walked into Jericho. They all wanted to see him, so much so that little Zacchaeus could not get a look at him. And so Zacchaeus climbs this tree, and Jesus chooses a notorious sinner, right? A notorious sinner, and says, I'm going to spend night with you. I'm going to have dinner with you. And we know there was Pharisees there. There were good people there. There were people that were keeping the law, people that hadn't sided with Rome. And Jesus says, I'm going to spend time with you. But in order for him to do that, Jesus had to give up his power and influence in that moment, and he had to instead embrace and bear the disdain of the crowd, the mocking of that crowd, the jeering of that crowd. He loved Zacchaeus that day, but at great cost to himself. He lost his reputation. And because of that, because Jesus lost his reputation in this little city of Jericho, Zacchaeus' world has changed. Zacchaeus looks at this moment at what Jesus does for him and says, you are willing to lose your reputation for me? My life is going to be different. I'm going to start living generously. This truth completely changed him. He sees the personal love of Jesus and he's moved to live differently. Now, listen to this. If Jesus losing his reputation for Zacchaeus produced this kind of life change, how much more does the fact that Jesus lost his life for you propel you to change? Right? Jesus didn't even die on the cross yet in this point of his life. Jesus had not been crucified yet for Zacchaeus' sin. Jesus had simply given up his power and reputation, and Zacchaeus sees that selfless act of love and says, I want to live different. I want to be changed. And he is. Not because he was able to, but because Jesus gave up so that he could. And we know that Jesus gave up his life for humanity so that our lives could be changed. See, at the cross, Jesus again had to bear the disdain of the crowd. Jesus again had the mocking and the jeering and the grumbling, and even more than that, placed on him. To be beat and whipped and crucified. Why? Why did he do that? Because he understood the notorious sinner Zacchaeus, he wasn't the only sinner in that day. He wasn't the only sinner in the world. Jesus understood that all of us have gone astray, that all of us have done what God has said not to, that all of us naturally lean towards selfishness. We don't think about what God wants for our lives. We live how we want. And God says that that's sin. And the whole crowd knew that Zacchaeus was a sinner, but the truth was that whole crowd was filled with sinners. That whole crowd was filled with people that Jesus would have to give up something for. And that something was his life. Because God looks at our sin and says, you are guilty and deserve to die. But Jesus Christ came to pay the penalty for our sin. Jesus died in our place. That's the truth that needs to land on our hearts. That's the only truth that has the power to change the way we are living. That is the gospel. And that gospel message makes us new. See, I don't want to just encourage you to try to attempt the way Zacchaeus lived. I don't want to encourage you to try to give more power, give more money, give more of yourself, give more time. If you're going to just try to do that, it's not going to end well, right? Who here is going to try some New Year's resolutions in January? I am, right? We're all going to try it. But then January 3rd is going to come. We're going to fail, right? Because every time we set out to do something, it's like, man, I just can't muster up enough strength to get this done. And God looks at us and says, no, you can't. You can never get enough strength to beat sin. But Jesus came and died on your behalf so that sin could be broken in you. C.S. Lewis, I talked about him before, but he writes in Mere Christianity, Jesus did not come to make us nice. He came to make us new. Think about that. Jesus didn't just come to make us nice people, to give more, to love people more, to make us nice people. I know a lot of nice people, and I want to be a nice person. But I also know that Jesus came to make me a new person, to live in a new way. I mean, that's what Zacchaeus is showing us here. He's showing us a new way to live, a pattern of living that is not dictated by do's and don'ts. And here's the law, Zacchaeus, give back 120%. He's saying, no, wait a second, I'm new now. I'm going to give 400%. Things are going to be different. What would it look like for you to live new today? I think Zacchaeus is giving us a clear application, especially if you're a believer here. And so if you would say that you're a Christian, that you're living for Christ, because of the grace of Jesus, like Zacchaeus, what if we no longer saw the law as a ceiling, but it became the floor? Right? That's what Zacchaeus experienced that day. What was a ceiling for other people, a cap, 120%, 10%. Good, I'm doing my due diligence. Zacchaeus saw that as a floor. He said, wait, that's my launching pad now. In light of what Jesus has done, I'm not going to stop there. And I want to encourage you today, if you're a Christian, what if you start blowing past what has maybe become a ceiling in your life? What if you start saying, you know what, instead of just giving a certain percent of my time, my money, instead of investing in relationships a certain way, what if we say, I want to do more? I want to really live generously, not something that's dictated by some law, but that's dictated by the life change that Jesus has made in my heart. But remember this change came after Jesus accepted Zacchaeus, after Jesus came into his life. And so if you're here and what I'm saying sounds like this is impossible, like living radically generous, there's no way I can do this, I would say maybe you don't yet understand what Jesus did for you. Because yes, it is impossible. It is totally impossible if your only thought is, I've got to do this. It has to begin with Jesus. Look at what Jesus did for me. If you're here and you're not a Christian, you wouldn't say that you believe in Jesus, that he's shaping your life. Would you begin on a journey of discovering who he is? Would you grab a connection card and there's a spot on there that says begin a relationship with Jesus? Check that off, drop it in the box on your way out. So this week we can grab coffee and we can just talk about who Jesus is and how he would change your life and what that looks like in my life. And look, everyone in this room is being changed by Jesus in some capacity. You know, maybe some of us are moving closer to the cross. Maybe some of us are hearing this and saying, I don't want any of this right now. But Jesus is going to bring a change in our hearts. The way we view him is going to change. But I would love for us to realize that grace causes us to leverage our power in a way that benefits other people. Grace frees us to give freely and boldly as we trust in God to meet all of our needs. And so what if you did decide, if I could talk about money for 1 minute, what if you did decide to give a percentage of your income away that actually cut into your power, that you actually felt, right? That you say, in response to what Jesus has done, in response to his giving up all of himself for me, I want to give away, because money, I mean, that's that thing that gets its grip on our heart. That's why I'm talking about it now. That's why Jesus talked about it, because it's that one thing that can grab us and captivate us. It's that thing that leads to more power. And so what if we decided, you know what I'm giving now is just not enough? All of us are giving away 1% of our income in this room. Every single person. Some of us it's 0. Some of us it's 1. Some of us it's 5. Some of us it's 10. But all of us have said, hey, some of my money I'm going to give away to help other people. What if this week you considered what Jesus has done for you and said, am I feeling this, what I've decided on? Is this cutting into some of my power? Like, do I actually have to say no to some things because I've decided, no, I'm giving that money away? And that's why for each of us, it's going to be different. That's why for each of us, as we understand more of the grace of God, it's going to change the way that we live generously, not just in our money, but in our time, in our relationships, in every area of our lives. Jesus' love for Zacchaeus changed him that day. And my hope is that you understand that Jesus' love for you personally, you should change the way that you're living. Let's pray. Good God, we thank you for this time in your word. We thank you that you sent your son to this world to demonstrate how much you love us. That Jesus that day looked at a notorious sinner, looked at someone the crowd hated, looked at a traitor, and said, I want to be in your life today. Father, I believe that this morning, Hope himself, Jesus himself, is saying the same thing to us. Father, I pray that each person in this room heard the gospel and will respond and will believe that your son Jesus came here to demonstrate your unique and personal love towards them. Father, cause us to live generously. Cause us to not look at do's and don'ts as a way of dictating our lives, but let us be filled with gratitude that Jesus gave up more than his reputation. He gave up his very life so that we can know you and be known by you. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.